The sky over Lancaster County was painted in soft amber tones, the kind that slipped through the wooden shutters of simple farmhouses and bathed worn wooden floors in warmth. In one of those houses, nestled between fields of hay and silence, lived a girl named Miriam. She rose with the sun, dressed in her plain gray dress and black bonnet, and walked barefoot through the fields while the dew still clung to the grass. Her life was quiet, rooted in chores and scripture, surrounded by the humble rhythms of the Amish way. She had never seen a television, never used a phone, and the only metal she wore was the pin that held her prayer covering in place. Yet something was changing around her, something unspoken, like a ripple in a still pond after a stone had been dropped in secret. It began with the black car. It was parked near the edge of her family's land, just past the post and rail fence that marked the end of their world and the beginning of everyone else's. At first, they thought it was lost, a traveler who took the wrong turn. But the car didn't leave. It returned the next day, and the next, always quiet, never crossing the fence line, its glossy surface reflecting the sunlight like an object that didn't belong. Miriam never looked directly at it, but she felt it. She felt the weight of its presence like eyes on her back when she hung clothes to dry. And when she asked her father about it, he simply said, "We do not concern ourselves with what waits on the other side of the fence." But someone had already crossed it, metaphorically at least. His name was Adam Holt, a billionaire whose empire stretched across cities, whose signature appeared on skyscrapers, tech patents, and investment portfolios, but whose presence now lingered silently at the edge of a cornfield. He had first seen Miriam at the local farmer's auction months before. She had arrived with her older brothers, standing quietly beside a cart of eggs and jars of apple butter. She had not noticed him, of course, nor his suit, nor his silent entourage. But he had noticed her, something in the stillness of her, the way her eyes held no interest in the world that revolved around power. That indifference had unsettled him in a way that no boardroom betrayal ever had. Adam didn't know why he came back to the county after that first glimpse. Perhaps it was boredom. Perhaps it was the kind of longing that money can't name but tries to solve with objects. So he started small. He sent flowers, wild ones, he thought would match the simplicity of her life. They were left at the fence, never acknowledged. Then came books, old volumes of poetry and literature, with pages he imagined she would trace with careful hands. They, too, were ignored. Finally, after weeks of silence and distance, he made a call to his assistant. "Something elegant," he said. "Something timeless. I want her to feel seen." The package arrived one morning in a black box, tied with a gold ribbon that shimmered in the sunlight like something from a fairy tale. A courier placed it gently by the wooden gate that separated the Holt estate's sleek sedans from the horses and buggies of the Amish fields. Inside was a custom-designed dress from one of the most exclusive fashion houses in Europe. Hand-stitched lace, soft ivory silk, a modest silhouette tailored with the highest craftsmanship. It was, by all accounts, stunning, both in its beauty and in its price. Adam believed it would speak where he could not. That it would say, "I see you, I admire you, and I respect the silence you've chosen." But what he did not understand was that love to Miriam could not be wrapped in satin or translated into seams. She found the package on her way to the barn, early enough that the dew still made her footsteps whisper. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon, not from excitement, but from the weight of what she feared it might mean. When the lid opened and the light fabric caught the morning breeze, she stood still for a long time. It wasn't the extravagance that bothered her, it was the implication. That someone believed her affection could be coaxed with threads, that her heart could be worn like a garment. She closed the box gently, carried it to the house, and set it on her bed. That evening, after her chores and prayers, she folded the dress carefully, smoothing each crease as if returning something sacred to the earth. Then she wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with twine, and left it on the same fence post where it had arrived. No note, no words, just the dress, returned folded. Adam received the package the next day. He unwrapped it in silence, his fingers brushing over the creases she had made. He had expected rejection in theory, but not in feeling. The folded dress spoke louder than any letter. It told him he had misjudged what beauty meant to her. It told him that elegance to Miriam was found in a sunrise, not in silk. That her heart was not a prize to be won, but a garden that required stillness, not spectacle. Back in her home, Miriam returned to her daily rhythm, as though nothing had occurred. She didn't speak of the dress to anyone, not even her mother, who raised a curious brow but said nothing. And yet, something inside her had shifted, not toward Adam, but toward the world beyond the fence. It wasn't curiosity. It was awareness. That no matter how quiet her life was, it had been seen. That her silence, so often overlooked, had been heard by someone who never knew silence himself. But she didn't seek him out. She didn't write, or ask questions, or gaze down the road where the car had once waited. She remained who she was, rooted, strong, still. What Adam did next would be his own journey. Whether he turned away or returned again was no longer her concern. She had said everything she needed to say with the way she folded that dress. Neatly, kindly, and with finality. Because for Miriam, love was never something to be offered in a box. It was something lived, wordless and daily, and nothing less than that would do. Adam Holt had never encountered a refusal that wasn't wrapped in conditions. In his world, rejection came as part of a negotiation tactic, an opening move to raise the stakes, a coy deflection meant to increase value. But the folded dress had carried no conditions, no counteroffer, not even indignation. It was an answer written in silence, and for the first time in years, it had left him with nothing to say. He kept the dress in its box, untouched on the marble counter of his penthouse apartment, even as his assistants asked if it should be returned to the designer or archived with the rest of his failed gestures. He didn't answer. It sat there for days, then weeks, as if waiting for him to understand something he wasn't ready to face. Across the country roads of Lancaster, Miriam moved forward without pause. Autumn was arriving early that year. The leaves rustled with the kind of crispness that signaled change, but her routine remained untouched. The harvest was approaching, and with it came the long days in the fields, the sorting of apples, the smell of cinnamon, and the comforting ache of labor done honestly. She had not spoken of the billionaire, nor of his dress. The memory had folded itself into the quiet corners of her mind like a piece of paper placed between the pages of a hymn book, present, but undisturbing. And yet, even though she returned to her simplicity, the stillness she had once inhabited completely was now marked by the faintest tremor of intrusion. Something had looked in, and part of her had looked back. Her father noticed it, not in words, but in her hands. She was still precise with the stitching, still strong with the buckets of feed, still reverent in prayer, but her fingers lingered too long sometimes when tying knots or folding linens, as if thoughts interrupted the muscle memory. One evening, as they sat beneath the oil lamp at the kitchen table, he asked her, not unkindly, "Is there something weighing on your spirit?" She didn't look up. Her fingers continued to mend the hem of her younger brother's coat. "No, Dad," she said softly, and though the answer was truthful, it was not complete. Back in the city, Adam became less visible to those who depended on him. Boardrooms gathered without him. Emails sat unread. He stared out the glass wall of his office at the skyline he helped design, feeling less ownership than he once did. His wealth had never failed him until now. It had opened every door, bought every silence, paved every detour. But it could not open a path to someone who lived by a code it didn't understand. He tried to reason through it like he did with mergers, what had gone wrong, what had been misread. He had respected her values, he thought. He had chosen a dress with modesty, with care. It had no label sewn on the outside, no insult in its tailoring. And yet, she had folded it like a garment from a stranger. He returned to Lancaster a second time, but not with gifts. He told his driver to stop at the same place, just outside the fence, but this time he didn't bring anything in hand. He simply stood at the edge of the property, eyes searching the rows of corn and the outline of the barn. He didn't expect to see her, but he hoped. What he saw instead was her younger brother, Ephraim, riding past on a wagon loaded with hay. The boy looked at him. No fear, just a neutral curiosity that lasted a second before he continued on his way. Adam realized then that to Miriam, his presence was not romantic or powerful. It was simply strange. And in their world, the strange was not welcome for long. Weeks passed. Then came winter. Snow blanketed the roads, and buggies moved slower. Miriam bundled herself in thick woolen layers, her cheeks red from the cold, her steps crunching over ice. The holiday season in her community was not about presents, but presence. There were no decorated trees or garland, only candles and hymns and gatherings where stories and service were exchanged instead of gifts. Her family, like others in the district, visited neighbors, brought bread, repaired fences, helped birth calves. In those moments, the weight of the outside world seemed to disappear, absorbed by the generosity that had no cost. But even there, in that purity, the memory of the dress remained. It came back not in sight, but in sound. When someone at the quilting circle mentioned the strange car again, the one that hadn't returned since the leaves fell. They wondered aloud who he was, that outsider, and what he had wanted. Miriam said nothing. She did not correct their assumptions or confirm them. She didn't even allow herself to wonder what he thought now, in whatever place rich men go when ignored. She had lived a life free of vanity, taught to shun pride, yet there was a flicker of something new now, something dangerously close to guilt. Not for rejecting him, but for having lingered in the thought of him. Adam, too, carried a new kind of silence, one that wasn't about strategy or regret, but humility. For the first time, he found himself reading scripture, not to find answers, but to listen. He went to a small bookstore and bought a Bible, then a second copy printed in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language he had heard her speak. He read slowly, not understanding every word, but holding each one like a key. He wanted to understand how someone could live in a world so different from his, where folded cloth spoke louder than wealth. That winter, he stopped traveling. He stayed in one place. His staff said he seemed quieter, more withdrawn, but also more present. He no longer filled silence with instructions. He asked questions instead. He started writing letters, not to Miriam, but to himself. He filled pages with thoughts, fears, things he had never told anyone. He began to wonder whether all his life, he had been searching not for connection, but for control. And the dress, returned folded, had undone more than a moment. It had unraveled a belief. In early spring, the thaw began. Snow melted from the eaves of the barns, and the earth began to soften beneath the soles of worn boots. Miriam's family began to prepare for the planting season. It was during one of these mornings, while cleaning out the barn, that Miriam found something strange tucked into the crook of a beam. It was a letter, folded carefully in brown paper, with no signature. Inside, in neat handwriting, were words not of apology, but of reflection. A man who had once offered a dress was now offering a thought, that perhaps the truest gift was not in the giving, but in the understanding that some things were never meant to be bought. She read it once, then again. She didn't tell anyone. She placed it inside her Bible, between the Psalms and Proverbs. Not as a treasure, but as a reminder, that even in silence, something had been heard. She did not reply. Not because she was angry, but because some answers are already given in the living, not in the writing. And just as she had returned the dress, folded and final, so too did she fold this moment into her life. Quietly, completely, and continued on. Spring deepened its roots in the fields of Lancaster, turning furrows into ribbons of green and coaxing wildflowers from the earth, as if to remind the land that life begins again, even after the coldest silence. Miriam walked those fields with practiced ease, her steps tracing the same paths she had known since childhood, yet something about her felt altered, as if the earth she tilled now echoed faintly with the weight of things left unsaid. She had not removed the letter from her Bible since placing it there. It rested quietly between verses of wisdom and lamentation, nestled like a seed not yet ready to break open. She did not reread it, not because it lacked meaning, but because she understood too deeply what it had already changed. It had not asked for her to answer, and that restraint had earned a quiet form of respect in her heart, one that neither condoned nor condemned, but acknowledged a shared understanding across a divide that neither of them could easily cross. Adam, on the other hand, had begun to understand the quiet in new ways. After years of commanding voices, digital alerts, and echoing conference halls, he found himself drawn to still places. He stopped attending his usual functions, declined invitations to galas and summits, and instead spent long hours walking through his own properties in upstate New York, where trees stood in rows like sentinels and the air carried no transactions. He dressed more simply, not as mimicry of a lifestyle he didn't own, but because the weight of image no longer fit him. He had begun to seek something unnameable, and though he would never admit it aloud, he felt that whatever that was, it had begun in the moment a folded dress came back to him without a single word. But change, no matter how quietly it takes root, rarely goes unnoticed forever. In Miriam's community, the rhythm of life thrived on observation and shared responsibility. Though no one questioned her directly, eyes lingered longer now when she passed. Some wondered why she seemed more distant in her focus, not distracted, but as though listening for something far away. Others speculated quietly about the visitor from the city who had left his car at the fence that past autumn. The unspoken truth in a tight-knit society is that silence draws just as much attention as speech, and in time, questions began to form, not in accusation, but in caution. Her father, a man who guarded his family's integrity with the same strength he used to plow the fields, noticed the tension in her shoulders one night and asked again if something troubled her. This time she said nothing, only folded her hands in her lap and watched the candle flame dance. It was during this season that a second letter came. It arrived not by courier or car, but inside a plain envelope left discreetly inside a basket of apples delivered from a local grocer, one that Adam had discreetly reached out to, requesting only that his note be placed somewhere Miriam might find it naturally, without intrusion. The letter bore no signature again, just the same careful handwriting, and it spoke not of longing or romance, but of a barn. He had purchased land on the outskirts of the county, far enough not to breach her world, but close enough to breathe the same wind. The barn had been abandoned when he bought it, weathered, broken, a skeleton of use. He had repaired it slowly, not with architects, but with his own hands and a few workers from the town. The letter contained no request, no invitation, only a description of what had been rebuilt, and a mention that sometimes healing begins with restoring what's been forgotten. Miriam read the letter sitting beneath an oak tree near the river, her bonnet tied tight against the wind. She traced each word with her eyes but did not smile. The idea of a billionaire hammering boards and mending beams felt foreign, almost absurd. But something deeper in her refused to laugh. Not because she believed it fully, but because she sensed that the act, whether misguided or not, had come from a place of effort rather than vanity. She folded the letter and placed it with the first, their edges beginning to curve slightly from use. Still, she said nothing to anyone. Her silence was no longer about fear or judgment. It was about control, about deciding when or if a response was ever owed at all. As the days grew longer, word of the restored barn began to reach the townsfolk. Whispers floated from post office lines to church potlucks about the man from the city who had bought the land but didn't build a mansion. He didn't pave the roads or put up gates. He had simply rebuilt the barn and left it empty. Some thought it was foolish. Others, romantic. Miriam heard it all and let it pass through her like wind through a screen door, present but unobstructive. She hadn't visited the barn, nor had she looked for it. And yet, in her mind, she pictured the wooden beams, the smell of sawdust and earth, and wondered for brief moments what it looked like to start something not for profit, but for peace. Meanwhile, Adam visited the barn every week. He brought no assistants, no photographers. He arrived in plain clothes, driving a used pickup truck he had purchased just for these trips. He spent hours inside the barn sanding wood, painting trim, and sometimes just sitting in the silence, letting the dust settle on his shoes. He didn't wait for her. He didn't even expect her. What had started as a gesture had become something else entirely, a place where he felt closer to something real. The barn did not judge him. It didn't ask for credentials or currency. It stood there, like Miriam had once stood at the market, quiet, enduring, unreachable. One afternoon, while repainting one of the window frames, he found himself staring at the road that stretched out past the trees. There was no sign of her, no footsteps in the grass, but he imagined her walking there, the wind catching her dress, her hands tucked into her apron. He didn't think of her as a prize anymore, nor a mystery to solve. She had become a mirror, reflecting back everything in him that he had never questioned before. The loneliness disguised as leadership, the ambition that had forgotten purpose. He understood now that the dress he had sent wasn't wrong in fabric, but in intent. It had come from the part of him that still believed things could be fixed with beauty, rather than truth. Back in her home, Miriam sat by the hearth knitting a shawl for her sister's newborn, the quiet click of needles marking time. Her thoughts drifted not to Adam himself, but to the distance between two people who live by different compasses. She had no desire to leave her life, no fantasy of what might exist beyond the fence. But the fence itself had changed. It was no longer a barrier, but a marker, of identity, of choice. She could see what lay beyond without needing to reach for it. She could acknowledge what had happened without surrendering who she was. And in that quiet, something like peace began to take shape. She did not write him. She did not visit the barn. But one morning, after the dew had settled and the fog lifted from the fields, she walked with a basket of fresh eggs to the road that ran past their land. She didn't expect to see anyone. She only stood there a moment, letting the stillness wrap around her like a prayer. Then she placed the basket gently near the path, tied with a simple note, "For the hands that repaired what was broken." She turned without waiting and walked home, her footsteps soft, steady, and sure. It was not an answer. It was not a beginning. It was simply something left behind, folded neatly like a dress returned without a word. The eggs were still warm when Adam found them, their shells smooth and unblemished, nestled neatly in a woven basket that smelled faintly of straw and morning. The note was written in plain ink, the handwriting careful and even, without flourish or signature. "For the hands that repaired what was broken." He stood beside the old fence for a long while, one hand on the wood, the other holding the note, as the wind rustled gently through the trees and whispered down the path Miriam had taken only hours before. It wasn't a message that invited response. It wasn't even a bridge. It was a gesture, brief and intact, left not as an invitation, but as acknowledgement. And for a man who had built his world on declarations, deals, and grand gestures, that quiet offering struck with more force than any yes ever had. He brought the basket into the barn, setting it on the clean workbench beside a folded tarp. He didn't eat the eggs. He left them there, as they were, each morning glancing at them like someone studying an icon, not for what it was but for what it meant. He no longer imagined what Miriam thought. He no longer rehearsed speeches or dreamed of ways to convince her of anything. The power to persuade had left him, not as a failure, but as a kind of freedom. In her silence, she had given him permission to be something other than a man trying to win. That season, he kept coming to the barn. He brought no one with him, and the townspeople had grown used to seeing his old truck rumble down the gravel roads in the early morning. He spoke little, paid in cash at the gas station, and wore the same worn boots every time. There was no pretense left in him. The barn had become more than a symbol. It was now a place where his hands remembered purpose. He started growing herbs in the side yard, clearing brush behind the structure, planting seeds without expecting harvest. He mended an old wooden table and set it beneath the open loft window where light poured in and dust floated like falling time. In the evenings, he sometimes sat at that table with a cup of tea he made himself, listening to the wind press gently against the walls. Back on the farm, Miriam's world turned in rhythm with the season. Chores multiplied as the sun rose earlier and set slower. There were calves to tend, quilts to finish, and church gatherings where her family read from scripture and sang in harmony. She never spoke of the basket she'd left or whether it had been taken. That wasn't the point. Her life moved forward, but the clarity with which she moved had deepened. Something about Adam's quiet persistence, his failure to demand anything in return, had shown her something unexpected. Not about him, but about herself. That she could be seen without being sold. That her refusal did not isolate her, it revealed what kind of ground she stood on. Word of Adam's presence faded into the background. It was no longer a subject of gossip. The novelty of a billionaire staying in a small cabin on a modest piece of land wore off. No mansion had been built. No parties had disturbed the silence. He kept to himself. Some even said he was restoring an orchard behind the barn. Miriam heard this in passing while shopping for flour at the general store, but she said nothing. She simply listened, her expression unchanged, though her heart beat a little differently when the name reached her ears. One evening, while the sky turned gold and the fields whispered with the last warmth of the day, she walked to the old fence again. This time she brought nothing. She didn't plan to leave a note or a gift. She simply felt pulled, not by longing, but by completion, like a sentence that had begun long ago and needed to be ended in full. She stood there for a moment, her hands folded in front of her apron, watching the road that bent out of sight, then turned away and walked back into the light of her home, where the oil lamp glowed and her mother was kneading bread. Adam, meanwhile, continued to change in ways too small for mirrors to notice but too deep to ignore. He woke earlier. He worked without music. He started reading books about farming, about soil chemistry, about seed types and heritage produce. He found solace in the mundane, scraping rust, staining wood, watering plants. For a man who had lived at the top of an empire, who had walked stages and lit up screens, this obscurity was not a fall. It was a revelation. He didn't miss the recognition. He didn't miss the luxury. He missed nothing. Because for the first time, he belonged somewhere not as an owner, but simply as a man. He hadn't seen Miriam again. Not once since the folded dress. And yet, her presence marked everything he did. Not in obsession but in clarity. She was not a goal. She had become a compass, one that pointed away from the noise he used to confuse for life. Her silence was not rejection anymore. It was instruction. He understood now that her values weren't constraints, they were coordinates. Then came the storm. A late summer squall descended on the county without warning. The skies blackened before noon, and the wind howled through the valley like a warning from the heavens. Trees bent, chickens scattered, and old roofs creaked with the weight of coming rain. In the barn, Adam worked without noticing the change until the first drops hit the tin roof like the ticking of 100 clocks. He moved quickly, securing loose boards and covering the equipment he'd been restoring. But the wind escalated, slamming the side door open and sending a gust that knocked tools from the wall. Outside, branches flew like spears. One cracked a window. Another tore the gutter loose from the side of the barn. He worked through it, soaked to the skin, his hands blistered but steady. The storm raged for hours. When it finally passed, the barn had held. Damaged, but upright. A few shingles lost, a door unhinged, but the structure stood. He slept that night on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, the silence after the wind feeling sacred. Miriam saw the barn 2 days later while riding past in her father's wagon. She noticed the broken window, the bent weather vane, the new patches of tarp over the roof. She said nothing, but when they returned home, she asked her father if they had any spare glass panes. "We might," he said. "Why?" She didn't answer. The next morning, before dawn, she packed a small bundle of tools, some nails, and a sheet of glass. She left without telling anyone where she was going. She walked the road alone, the sun just rising, and when she reached the barn, she knocked gently on the open frame of the door. Adam was inside, sweeping sawdust from the corner. He looked up and froze. She stood there in her apron and bonnet, the bundle under her arm, her face calm. She didn't smile, but her eyes were not cold. She simply nodded once, stepped inside, and walked toward the broken window. Without a word, she set her things down and began measuring the frame. They worked side by side for hours, still without speaking. He handed her nails when she needed them. She held a board steady while he hammered. There was no music, no rustle of pages, only the sound of work being done, shared, silent, honest. When the pane was finally installed, she cleaned the glass with the edge of her apron, then stepped back and looked at it, satisfied. She turned to him, nodded once more, and walked out without explanation. He didn't follow. He didn't call her name. He only stood there for a long time, his hands still full of the last tool she'd used, and understood in that moment that something more powerful than yes or no had been exchanged. She hadn't come to talk. She hadn't come to forgive or explain. She had come to build, and in that act, she had shown him more grace than any gift could buy. That night, he sat at the table beneath the loft window again. The stars were out, clear and brilliant, and the wind was still. He placed the old dress box on the table, opened it slowly, and ran his hand over the fabric one last time. Then he folded the lid, tied it shut with twine, and placed it in the corner of the barn, beneath a quilt she had left drying years before. It was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a marker of where everything had turned. And outside, somewhere between the fields and the moonlight, Miriam walked home alone, her steps steady, her heart unburdened, and her silence finally shared. As the days stretched longer into the heart of summer, the fields in Lancaster County shimmered with the gold of ripening crops and the stillness of anticipation. The air carried a kind of weight that did not come from humidity, but from moments unspoken and lives quietly shifting in parallel. Miriam returned to her routines, but her hands no longer moved with the same unconscious repetition. Every motion, from milking the goats to folding linens, seemed to carry an extra layer of deliberation, as though some invisible thread now wove through each hour of her day. Her visit to the barn had not been discussed, not even by her family, who had noticed her absence but chose not to press. The unspoken was not a secret in their world, it was a form of trust. And though no one asked where she had been, her mother placed an extra slice of bread on her plate that evening and sat beside her in silence longer than usual. The barn remained as she had left it, window mended, dust cleared, tools lined neatly along the wall. Adam didn't alter the space after she left. He didn't clean away the fingerprints from the glass or rearrange the tools she had used. He left it all as it was, as a quiet testament to the fact that something had happened between them that needed no words. In the following days, he continued to tend the orchard and the small garden he had started behind the barn. The vegetables were coming in strong: beans, carrots, tomatoes, and he began leaving baskets of them at the local food pantry without adding his name. He made these deliveries at dawn, before anyone could see, not out of shame, but because he no longer felt the need to be seen to be known. His life had narrowed and deepened. The calls from his corporate offices became less frequent. His absence from board meetings no longer sparked questions, it became an accepted mystery, a silent resignation from a world he had once ruled. His apartment in Manhattan remained untouched, his wardrobe unworn, his watches unwound in their velvet-lined drawers. The world he had built had not collapsed, it had simply become irrelevant. What had once been his identity was now just a shell. And at the center of his new life stood the barn and the memory of a girl who had returned his designer gift with more dignity than defiance. Miriam did not return to the barn in the weeks that followed, but her thoughts did. Often at night, as she finished reading scripture by lantern light, she found her eyes drifting to the page without seeing the words, her mind retracing the quietness of that shared labor. She didn't imagine a future with him, nor did she indulge in fantasies. What remained in her memory was not Adam as a man, but Adam as a gesture, a man who had crossed a world to meet her in stillness, not in force. The simplicity of it, the absence of demand, had left a mark deeper than any declaration could have. And though her world remained unchanged on the surface, something within her had opened slightly, like a door pushed ajar by a wind too soft to be seen. It was during one of these quiet nights that a visitor came to their home. A stranger, though not unfamiliar. One of Adam's former partners, Harold Lentz, had arrived unannounced, his black car raising a cloud of dust as it rolled up the dirt path leading to the Yoder farm. Miriam's father met him at the gate, his stance polite but firm. Harold introduced himself not as a businessman, but as a concerned friend. He spoke of Adam's disappearance from public life, of his sudden withdrawal, and of the investors who had begun to panic at his silence. "He's living in a barn," Harold said, as though that explained everything. "He doesn't take meetings, doesn't answer calls. I've come to ask if your daughter knows why." Miriam heard the conversation through the open kitchen window. She stepped outside before her father could respond, wiping her hands on her apron. "I don't know why," she said simply, her voice steady. "And if he is where you say he is, I believe it's where he needs to be." Harold looked at her, eyebrows raised not in mockery, but in disbelief. He had expected a recluse, perhaps a recluse's muse, someone strange or bitter. But she stood with calm authority, her gaze clear. He thanked her, nodded once to her father, and left without further question. That night, Adam found a letter tucked beneath a basket of tomatoes at the barn's entrance. It wasn't from Miriam. It was from Harold. It said only, "She didn't defend you. She didn't explain you. She just believed you." Adam read it slowly, folded the note, and placed it beside the others in the drawer he had carved into the side of the workbench. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the strange rush of grace that those few words carried. It was not admiration. It was something deeper. Belief without possession. Support without explanation. As summer waned and harvest time approached, Adam began to prepare the barn for something he had not planned. He cleared space in the loft, refinished the staircase, and built a long wooden table from reclaimed boards. He didn't know who would sit at it or why. He only knew that something about the space called for readiness. He replaced the old lanterns, installed a small stove, and repaired the door hinges until they no longer squeaked. His days became a ritual of preparation, not expectation. He began to sleep in the loft more often than in the small guest house he had built behind the barn. It wasn't comfort that drew him there. It was quiet, the kind that held a man accountable to his own thoughts. Miriam noticed the changes from afar. On Sundays, as the wagon passed near the barn on the way to church, she would glance once and then look away. But those glances lingered in her thoughts. The barn looked different now. Not in its structure but in its energy. It no longer looked like a forgotten place being repaired. It looked like a space waiting to be used. Still, she did not go. She believed in timing, not impulse. And while her heart no longer resisted his presence, it did not yet trust the purpose of what they were becoming. Then came the letter. Not placed at the fence or hidden in a basket, but delivered openly, respectfully, by a neighbor who had seen Adam walking through town. It was written in the same careful handwriting, and addressed not to win, but to invite. He was hosting a simple dinner at the barn. No guest list. No speeches. Just food and silence. If she wished to come, a seat would be open. If not, there would be no follow-up. She read the letter that evening, seated at the corner of her family's wooden table. Her mother glanced at her once, then returned to kneading dough. Her father said nothing. Miriam folded the letter and held it in her lap for several minutes. The barn. Dinner. No pressure. No audience. She thought of the table he had built, of the window she had helped repair, of the silence that had shaped every moment between them. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, she made her decision, not out of curiosity or pressure, but because the invitation felt more like a conversation she had already begun answering long ago. 3 nights later, she walked the road to the barn, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth tucked under her arm. Her dress was simple, her bonnet tied tight, her footsteps sure. The barn doors stood open, light glowing softly from within. No music played. No crowd murmured. Just one man, seated at the head of a table, standing quietly as she entered. He did not move toward her. He did not speak first. He simply waited. And when she stepped inside and placed the bread on the table, she looked him in the eye for the first time with neither fear nor defiance. Then she sat. They ate quietly. No blessing was spoken aloud, but reverence filled the room. He had prepared stew, roasted vegetables, fresh butter, and tea. She thanked him once. He nodded once in return. The conversation was not in words. It was in the passing of plates, in the folding of napkins, in the glances that held no demand. When the meal was done, they sat for a moment longer. Then Miriam stood, took the empty loaf cloth, and turned to leave. He didn't rise, didn't speak. She paused at the door, hand on the frame, then looked over her shoulder and said, "The table was well built." And with that, she disappeared again into the night, leaving behind nothing but the echo of a sentence that held more grace than any declaration of love. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a promise. But it was the closest thing to home he had ever heard. The morning after the dinner in the barn, the light broke gently over the ridge of the hills, bathing the valley in a soft, golden stillness. Inside the barn, Adam stood beside the long wooden table, now empty but not abandoned. The scent of roasted vegetables and warm bread still lingered faintly in the air, blending with the aged pine and the coolness of dew creeping through the open windows. He hadn't slept that night, not from restlessness, but from the weight of something unfamiliar, peace without possession. Her words, "The table was well built," echoed in his thoughts like a quiet hymn. Not praise, not affection, but acknowledgement, the kind that only meant something when it came from someone who owed him nothing. For a man who had been taught to measure progress through acquisition and response, it was a strange but sacred sensation to realize that someone could see him, not for what he had tried to give, but for what he had learned to become. Miriam's walk home had been silent. The moon guided her path between cornfields and unlit roads, and her feet moved with the same quiet certainty that had brought her to the barn in the first place. She hadn't stayed to make conversation. That had never been the point. What she had offered by showing up was not a shift in her beliefs or a loosening of her boundaries. It was an answer to a question that had never been asked aloud. She had broken bread at his table. She had accepted his effort. And in her world, that kind of gesture held more truth than any courtship or confession. The next morning, she rose before the sun, churned butter with her mother, milked the cows with her brothers, and resumed the rhythm of a life she had never once considered escaping. But something had softened within her, not in her convictions, but in her sense of aloneness. The distance she had always kept between herself and the world beyond the fence now felt more like a choice than a sentence. And that made all the difference. The townspeople, though curious, said little. Those who saw her walking toward the barn that night did not speak of it in public. Lancaster was a place where lives were lived in plain view, but certain silences were respected, especially when they surrounded someone like Miriam. She was not easily misunderstood, nor was she known for folly. If she had chosen to cross a line, it was not out of recklessness, but out of purpose. That knowledge held the community in quiet patience, watching but not intervening. Adam, too, remained still. He did not call her. He did not write. He did not host another dinner or send another invitation. He returned to the work of the land, spending his mornings harvesting vegetables, mending fences, and tending to the orchard that now bloomed with a gentle defiance against the wild. The apple trees he had planted months earlier had begun to take root, their leaves strong and green, their branches stretching skyward. He watched them closely, not for fruit, but for growth. He understood now that not everything planted was meant to be harvested quickly. Some things grew on a timeline that defied logic and resisted urgency. Like people. Like trust. Weeks passed. The heat of late summer gave way to the slow cooling of September. School resumed in the Amish district, and the children returned to their studies in the one-room schoolhouse down the road. Miriam's younger siblings came home with ink-stained fingers and laughter in their voices. She helped them with their chores, combed her sister's hair before supper, and sat with her father on the porch as he carved wood by lantern light. She asked no questions about Adam and spoke no words of the dinner. Yet her gaze wandered often to the edge of the fields, to the place where the barn stood just out of sight, and her mind lingered there longer than she would ever admit. Adam noticed a small change, too. One morning, he found a jar of blackberry jam left on the edge of the workbench, no note, just a ribbon of cloth tied neatly around the lid. It wasn't from the market. He recognized the pattern of the fabric as one that had once belonged to Miriam's mother's apron. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that carried the weight of continued presence. She was still there, still watching, still willing to give, in small ways, what she would not say in words. The jam remained unopened for days, not out of neglect, but out of reverence. He placed it on the shelf beside the lantern she had once cleaned, and let it sit as a kind of reminder, not of her, but of the space she had allowed him to grow into. And as the season crept toward the time of harvest festivals and community gatherings, Adam began to understand that he had no role in her world beyond what she allowed. He had no entitlement to her story, no right to demand her affection. All he could do was continue to live in a way that honored what she had taught him, not through instruction, but through refusal. It was during this time that Miriam's father became ill. It began with a cough, then a fever, then days of silence and sweat beneath heavy quilts. The community rallied, as they always did, neighbors bringing food, elders sitting vigil, the bishop stopping by to offer prayers. Miriam stayed by her father's side, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, reading to him from the Psalms, wiping his brow with cool cloths. Her mother kept the household running, and her brothers took over the work in the fields. But Miriam never left the house, not even to attend church. Her world narrowed to the four walls of her father's room and the quiet struggle of a man she loved more than words could carry. News of the illness reached Adam through the grocer, whose nephew was married to Miriam's cousin. It traveled without intent, just a fact passed over the counter along with potatoes and flour. Adam said nothing, simply nodded, paid in cash, and left. But that afternoon, he sat alone in the barn, the silence around him no longer peaceful but heavy, unsettled. He wanted to help, but not intrude. He wanted to offer something, but not offend. He walked the length of the barn again and again, hands in his pockets, mind wrestling with the paradox of doing nothing versus doing too much. Finally, he settled on the only thing that made sense. He returned to his orchard and filled a crate with apples, firm, sweet, carefully picked. He wrapped them in cloth to protect their skin and placed them gently into a wooden box he had built himself. Then he left it at the edge of the fence near their home, no note, no signature, just fruit and care and presence. He didn't stay to see who found it. He didn't expect a response. He only knew that sometimes, healing didn't come through grand gestures, but through sustenance offered quietly at the edge of someone's pain. Miriam found the box the next morning. Her eyes caught the corner of the cloth as she returned from gathering water. She didn't touch it at first. She stood there, her heart already knowing who had left it, her breath caught between suspicion and gratitude. Then she lifted the crate, felt its weight, and carried it into the house. Her mother looked at her once, then looked away. They didn't speak of it. But that night, the apples were sliced and stewed into a compote for her father, who managed his first full meal in days. He didn't ask where the fruit came from. He only whispered, "Sweet as summer rain," and fell asleep with a faint smile on his face. That same night, Miriam stepped outside alone and stood near the edge of the fence. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the night was thick with crickets and wind. She didn't expect to see anyone. She didn't want to. She only stood there, holding the memory of the crate in her arms and letting the air carry whatever answer she wasn't yet ready to give. Behind her, the house glowed faintly, her father sleeping peacefully for the first time in a week, her mother humming low as she cleaned the hearth. And in the stillness of that space, between duty and desire, she found herself no longer standing at the edge of two worlds, but holding both, in balance, without needing to choose. And in the barn, far down the road, Adam sat in the loft beside the open window, unaware of her presence at the fence, but somehow feeling the shift. The wind had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. And that, more than any word or gift, was enough. The signs of autumn were no longer subtle. The wind carried a crispness that cut through fabric and skin alike, pulling the scent of dying leaves through every open window and across every field. Trees stood like old sentinels shedding their last offerings, and the golden hours of the day grew shorter, giving way to twilight far sooner than before. Life in the valley had slowed to a contemplative pace, where each task held more weight and each silence was filled with reflection rather than routine. Miriam's home, once bursting with emotions of harvest, had grown quieter as her father's recovery demanded less urgency and more watchfulness. He spent most of his time seated near the front porch, wrapped in blankets, speaking little but observing everything. Her mother, worn from weeks of care and quiet concern, moved with the weary grace of someone who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Inside this evolving rhythm, Miriam became something like a hinge between the world she had always known and the weight of something she could no longer keep locked away. Though she woke with the same prayers and stepped into the same shoes each day, her mind drifted constantly toward the one place she had never meant to return to more than once. Across the distant pastures, the barn had become a sanctuary not for isolation, but for transformation. The once broken structure now resembled a living memory, every beam and board carrying with it the story of labor not done for glory, but for healing. Adam had stopped counting the days since their last encounter. He no longer marked the passage of time with hope or regret. Instead, he found comfort in the repetition of care, repairing tools, tending to the orchard, sweeping the same corner floorboards that never seemed to stay clean. There was no more longing in his gestures, no more expectation behind his presence. What had begun as a pursuit had long since become a form of devotion, not to a person, but to a lesson. The folded dress, still resting untouched inside its box, remained in the same place beneath the old quilt, not out of fear or reverence, but as a reminder that some answers, when spoken too loudly, lose their meaning. In the stillness of those days, he had begun to understand that love without ownership and kindness without reward were rarer than any form of wealth he had ever known. As the community prepared for the final gatherings before winter, simple harvest meals, church suppers, and quiet evenings of scripture reading, there was a subtle shift in how people looked at Miriam. They did not ask questions, and no accusations were ever spoken aloud, but the weight of attention was there nonetheless. In a world governed by tradition and upheld by generations of silent discipline, deviation did not need to be dramatic to cause concern. It only needed to exist. Her presence was still welcomed, her work still appreciated, but the warmth of assumption had cooled slightly into the quiet scrutiny that comes from those who care deeply about the preservation of their way of life. She felt it in the way conversations paused when she entered the room, and in the way glances lingered a second longer than necessary when she chose to remain quiet. The name of the outsider was never mentioned, but his shadow lived in their silence. One morning, as the frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the roof and the lanterns burned a little longer to compensate for the late sunrise, Miriam carried out her chores with a deliberate steadiness, as if holding back an invisible tide of thought with every movement. She had long learned that the body, when kept busy, could offer a temporary shelter from the noise of the mind, but the shelter was never permanent. As she poured feed into the troughs and gathered eggs from the nesting boxes, her thoughts remained tangled around the image of the barn, the memory of that dinner, and the space between then and now that seemed too vast to cross again, yet too small to ignore. The certainty she had once felt about the borders of her world was no longer whole. It had been fractured not by temptation or desire, but by something more disarming, being seen without being touched, understood without being changed. Meanwhile, Adam continued his days without interruption or interference, though he, too, was aware of the shifting temperature of things, both literal and emotional. The quiet around him had grown heavier in recent weeks. The deliveries he once made to the pantry were still received, but no longer commented on with the same polite gratitude. The local storekeeper had become more reserved. The passerby who used to nod with faint curiosity now avoided meeting his gaze. It did not surprise him. In truth, he had expected it sooner. His presence had always been tolerated rather than welcomed, and the longer he remained, the more his refusal to leave became a statement, one that needed no declaration. And yet he stayed. Not out of pride or defiance, but because leaving now would mean running from a place that had, for the first time, asked him for nothing and offered him everything in return. The land had accepted him without ceremony, and he would not betray it with retreat. What neither of them could see was the slow, unspoken unraveling of a moment neither had planned to share again. It came not in the form of confrontation or confession, but in the steady progression of inevitability. The season was changing, and with it came decisions that could no longer be delayed. For Miriam, the pressure was not external. Her father never forbade her from speaking to Adam again. Her mother never scolded. The bishop never approached. But the silence they left in place carried its own form of urgency. It was understood that if no formal separation occurred soon, if no clarity was restored, then confusion would take root. And confusion, in a world built on order, could not be allowed to spread unchecked. Miriam felt the weight of this truth pressing more firmly with each day. She continued to work, to pray, to listen, but her heart no longer beat in one direction. Her spirit had become divided, not by love, but by principle. What she had found in Adam was not a rival to her way of life, but a mirror to its deepest teachings. And yet, even as she admired his transformation, she could not ignore the reality that he did not belong. He had changed, yes, but the world he came from still clung to him in ways he might never see. He moved through her land with the care of someone trying not to disturb it, but his very presence, however quiet, altered the atmosphere. And so, on a morning when the frost finally gave way to the first true bite of winter, Miriam stepped away from the table after breakfast and walked outside into the cold, alone. Her path was not toward the barn, not this time. She walked instead into the woods behind her home, where the ground was soft with damp leaves and the canopy above was thin and bare. There, away from roads and fences and expectations, she knelt beside the base of an old tree and closed her eyes. It was not a place of decision, but a place of surrender. She had nothing left to weigh. She could not become what she wasn't, and she would not ask anyone else to do so either. Whatever Adam had meant to her, whatever he still did, it was no longer hers to carry forward. The next day, she rose early and baked a small loaf of bread, just enough for one person. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth and placed it gently inside a basket. Alongside it, she tucked a folded note, not with words, but with a single verse from Scripture that spoke of time, of planting, of letting go. Then she walked the road to the barn one last time. She did not enter. She did not knock. She left the basket by the door, turned back toward the rising sun, and walked home in silence, her shoulders neither heavy nor light, but still. Adam found the basket that afternoon. He recognized the fabric immediately. He lifted the cloth, revealing the bread, still warm when it had been left, now cooled by the hours. He did not search for more. He did not open the folded paper. He did not need to. He knew what it meant. It was not a goodbye. It was not a beginning. It was the closing of a circle, the final breath of something that had never demanded to be more than what it was. He carried the basket inside and placed it on the table, then walked to the back of the barn and stood by the window she had once restored with her own hands. The view had not changed. The world outside still moved with the same quiet grace. But within him, something had finally settled. And when night fell over the valley, and the last of the day's warmth slipped beneath the hills, the barn stood silent and whole, the orchard still, the stove cold, and the folded dress untouched in its box, resting now not as a symbol of rejection, but as the memory of a path that had been walked in silence and returned with dignity. The first snow arrived earlier than expected that year, soft and quiet, like a sigh that covered the fields in a white hush before anyone could prepare. The trees stood stripped and motionless, their bare arms raised as if in silent surrender to the cold. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, graceful lines, and the roads became slower, every footstep more deliberate. Inside the Amish homes scattered across the valley, lamps glowed longer into the evenings and families drew closer around stoves and Scripture, their world tightening like the seams of a well-mended coat. In Miriam's home, the days resumed their shape after the weeks of uncertainty. Her father's strength had returned enough for him to take slow walks between the barn and the back porch. Her mother's hands found their rhythm again in the kitchen and at the loom. The house held the hum of life, steady and sacred, like an old song returning to the tongue after a long silence. Miriam, too, moved within this pattern, yet her movements had deepened, as if each task she completed carried with it an awareness that was not there before. She had made no announcements, no confessions. Her family had asked no questions. But all of them, in their own way, had understood that something had closed behind her, not out of anger or shame, but with the quiet finality of a door pulled shut by the wind. Across the county line, the barn stood firm under its first layer of snow, its roof newly white, its wooden frame darker against the pale ground. The orchard behind it lay dormant, its branches reaching upward like a cathedral of bones waiting for resurrection. Inside, the air was cold but not abandoned. Adam had remained, not out of stubbornness, but because leaving now would have made everything meaningless. He had stopped trying to understand what she might feel or think. He no longer measured her silences for answers. What he had built in the barn was not a bridge to reach her, but a space that proved he had learned to exist without taking. And in that understanding, he had found the only form of peace that didn't dissolve when unmet expectations fell away. The folded dress remained untouched in its box, now resting beneath a blanket that Miriam herself had once helped him move. He had never opened it again. It was not a wound. It was a lesson sealed shut, and it no longer needed to be revisited to be remembered. As the snow deepened and the landscape transformed into a canvas of soft contours and soundless distances, Adam's world grew even quieter. The few remaining interactions with townspeople became brief, transactional, courteous but cold. No one told him to leave. No one confronted him. But the valley was not a place where rejection needed words. It only needed time. He sensed it in the way his presence no longer stirred curiosity, only fatigue. The land had let him borrow its silence, but not its belonging. And so, he began to prepare. Not to return to the life he had left behind, but to carry forward what he had found, wherever it might still hold meaning. The barn, which had once served as a refuge, had now completed its work. It had made him honest. It had made him still. On the last morning of December, as snowflakes fell in thick, deliberate spirals, Adam lit the stove in the barn one final time. He did not rush through the motions. He boiled tea slowly, stacked the wood with care, swept the floor, and oiled the hinges of the doors. He took the folded dress and placed it in the center of the table, not to reopen it, but to acknowledge that it had been returned not just once, but forever. He placed the note Miriam had left weeks ago beside it. He read the scripture again, this time not with longing or regret, but with full comprehension. There is a time to embrace, and a time to refrain. There is a time to keep, and a time to cast away. He had not been cast out. He had been shown the limits of grace, and he respected them. As evening approached, he packed his belongings with the same simplicity that had become part of his being. One satchel, one coat, one notebook. He left the barn unlocked. There was nothing of value to take, only the echo of things done without expectation. Miriam watched from a distance as his truck disappeared down the snow-lined road, its tires leaving faint indentations that the wind would soon erase. She did not cry. She did not pray for his return. She only stood beneath the frame of the back porch and held a warm cup between her hands, letting the steam rise into the bitter air. Inside her, nothing felt broken. What they had shared had not been a mistake. It had been a season. And seasons, by nature, do not ask to be extended, they ask to be remembered. The man who had once believed that love could be purchased had learned instead how to give without taking. And she, who had once feared the loss of self through closeness, had discovered that presence could exist without compromise. They had met not in romance, but in recognition. Through the long winter that followed, the barn remained standing, visited only by snow and time. Birds nested in its beams. Wind passed through its rafters. It did not decay, because what had been restored there had not depended on anyone staying. It had depended only on the sincerity of what had taken place. Miriam passed by it occasionally on errands or long walks. She never entered again. She never needed to. Just seeing its outline against the horizon was enough to remind her that stillness could build something lasting, even when two lives continued in different directions. Adam did not return to the city as the man he had once been. He didn't reclaim his empire, though parts of it still waited for his signature. He declined offers to resume his seat at various tables. He lived in a smaller place, closer to the earth, surrounded by fewer people and fewer things. His voice became softer, his schedule emptier, and every now and then, in the quiet of a morning frost or the texture of an apple's skin, he would remember the valley, not with sorrow, but with reverence. The story of the dress became, in time, a quiet myth among the younger Amish, told carefully by those who remembered the year the outsider came and changed nothing, and yet, somehow, changed everything. It wasn't spoken of with scandal or bitterness, but with the kind of humility that attaches itself only to stories where pride had no place. A man once brought a gift that was folded and returned. And instead of walking away angry, he stayed and built something with his hands. And then, when there was nothing more to do, he left. And the girl. She never left, never sought anything beyond her world. But she remembered. She remembered the barn, and the tea, and the quiet meal that said everything words could never hold. And in her remembering, she did not wonder what could have been. She simply gave thanks for what had been allowed. And through the passing years, whenever she taught her own children about generosity, about patience, about the strength it takes to say no and still remain open-hearted, she did so with the calmness of someone who had lived the lesson and carried no burden from it. And as you finish this story, if it touched you, if it made you see something in silence that words often fail to show, we ask only one thing: subscribe to the channel. Support these stories so that more can hear them. Stories like this live not in volume, but in memory. Help us carry them forward.